The lights of the Manhattan broadcast studio were blindingly bright, but Karoline Leavitt thrived in them. She sat upright in the guest chair of the Nightline debate, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her tone sharp and rehearsed. Across from her sat Ibrahim Traoré, the young, charismatic president of Burkina Faso, invited to discuss global aid, U.S.-Africa relations, and political independence. But nobody in the room, not even the host, was prepared for what came next. It started off tense. Traoré, wearing a tailored dark suit with a subtle African pattern stitched into the lapel, calmly articulated his country's move toward economic self-sufficiency. He argued that foreign aid was often weaponized, a tool for manipulation, not support. Karoline raised an eyebrow, waiting for her chance to strike. "Are you seriously trying to lecture Americans on ethics?" she said, leaning forward, voice dripping with sarcasm. "You run a country that most of us couldn't even find on a map. And now you want to pretend like you're some kind of global leader?" The studio went quiet. Even the host, Mark Barlow, widened his eyes, unsure whether to intervene. Traoré didn't blink. Karoline wasn't finished. She gestured toward him and added, "Let's be honest, Ibrahim. You're here because you love the spotlight, not because you've earned a seat at this table. You come from a desert with no functioning democracy, no real press, and no Starbucks. You don't belong here." Gasps rippled through the control room. Cameras zoomed in. The moment was going viral in real time. The hashtag Leavitt vs. Traoré started trending on X, formerly Twitter, before the segment even ended. But Traoré didn't raise his voice. He didn't interrupt. He waited. And when Karoline stopped to sip her water with smug satisfaction, he leaned into the microphone. "Miss Leavitt," he began with calm precision, "you may think insults make you powerful. But what they really do is make you irrelevant. You just turned a policy discussion into a schoolyard mockery, and that's not leadership." The host tried to wrap the segment, but Traoré continued, "You insulted not just me, but the dignity of millions of people watching around the world. And I assure you, there will be consequences." Hours later, as clips of the debate exploded across social media, Traoré's legal team announced he would be filing a defamation lawsuit against Karoline Leavitt for $100,000, citing reputational damage, public humiliation, and deliberate mischaracterization. It wasn't just about money, it was about drawing a line. And for Karoline Leavitt, the fight she started on live TV was about to follow her into a courtroom. By sunrise the next day, nearly every major news outlet had the same headline flashing across their screens. Traoré files $100,000 lawsuit against Leavitt. Underneath were stills from the live debate. One frame frozen on Karoline's sneer, another on Traoré's calm, unwavering stare. At first, Karoline laughed it off during a Morning Fox segment. "Let him sue," she scoffed. "This is America. If he can't handle a little heat, maybe he really doesn't belong in the kitchen." But in private, her team wasn't laughing. The legal notice had been carefully worded, a strategic masterpiece. It accused Karoline Leavitt of knowingly launching personal, baseless attacks intended to discredit Traoré's leadership and reputation on an international platform. Her mockery, it claimed, wasn't political discourse, it was malicious defamation. Traoré's attorney, Lizette Mensah, spoke at a brief press conference outside Manhattan Civil Court. "This lawsuit is not about silencing dissent. It's about defending dignity." President Traoré was invited as a guest, not as a punching bag for political theater. "We're not seeking millions. We're seeking accountability." Inside Karoline's campaign office, phones were ringing non-stop. Her donors were divided. Some loved the spectacle. Others, especially those from international business lobbies, were growing uneasy. A defamation suit from a foreign head of state was unprecedented, and even if symbolic, it was making headlines in Europe, Asia, and across Africa. "This guy's smarter than we thought," muttered her communications director, scrolling through a viral clip of Traoré's calm takedown. "He didn't raise his voice once, and now everyone's calling him the adult in the room." Meanwhile, Traore had returned to Burkina Faso and resumed his schedule like nothing had happened. In a televised speech to university students in Ouagadougou, he addressed the controversy without mentioning Karoline's name. "You don't fight fire with fire," he said. "You fight it with discipline, clarity, and principle. We don't sue for revenge. We sue for the record. Let the world know that dignity is not negotiable." The students erupted in applause. Back in the U.S., Karoline's legal team met in hushed tones. The lawsuit wasn't about the money, that much was clear. It was about the narrative. The optics. And she was losing that battle fast. "This isn't a man from the desert," one of her aides finally admitted. "This is a man who understands media, power, and justice, better than most of D.C." Karoline Leavitt's campaign war room had become a bunker of tension. The digital team was scrubbing her social channels, deleting old posts that might fuel the narrative that she held racial or cultural biases. The legal team had compiled over 300 pages of talking points. And her lead attorney, Grant Milton, paced the floor like a man preparing for battle. "He caught us off guard," Milton said, staring at the projected transcript from the debate. "He baited you, and you walked straight into it." Karoline folded her arms. "I didn't bait anything. I told the truth." "No," Milton said sharply. "You mocked a foreign president on live television, mocked his country, his people, and his legitimacy. That's not truth. That's ammunition." She didn't respond. But the silence in the room said what she wouldn't. Traore had flipped the script. While Karoline scrambled to control the damage, Traore had already moved on to more strategic terrain. Back in Ouagadougou, he had granted an exclusive interview to the Washington Post. In it, he framed the lawsuit as a stand for international respect and equal footing, pointing out how Western politicians often invite leaders from the global South for symbolic reasons, then humiliate them for views they don't like. "I didn't come to America to be insulted," he said. "I came to speak as an equal. If you don't see me that way, then perhaps it is your definition of democracy that needs adjusting." That single quote hit like a shockwave. Pundits, academics, and human rights leaders began weighing in. On MSNBC, a legal analyst said bluntly, "If the goal was to make Traore look small, it backfired. He now looks like a global statesman demanding accountability without hysteria." On X, the hashtag #StandWithTraore began trending worldwide. Memes showed him with the caption, "Calm is power." Commentators started comparing him to other historical figures who had faced public humiliation with quiet defiance. And yet, inside her office, Karoline was beginning to realize that this wasn't just a PR crisis, it was a battle of legacy. "This guy is using the lawsuit like a chess move," she muttered. "Not for court. For history." Her campaign manager nodded. "And if we don't change strategy soon, he's going to checkmate you." 2 weeks had passed since the broadcast. In most political news cycles, that would be the end of it, a few viral clips, a trending hashtag, maybe a meme or two. But this was different. The story had legs. And it was running straight through the American psyche. In downtown Atlanta, a mural of Ibrahim Traoré had been spray-painted on the side of a community center. Underneath it read, "Dignity has no borders." On college campuses, debate clubs had taken up the lawsuit as a case study. Was Traoré right to sue? Had Karoline crossed the line from political commentary into character assassination? Even late-night comedians weighed in. Karoline Leavitt told a foreign president he didn't belong on TV, joked Trevor Noah. And he said, "Cool. I'll meet you in court, then." That's the most presidential move I've seen in a while. But the turning point came when a leaked video surfaced, raw footage from before the debate had gone live. In the clip, Karoline could be heard rehearsing lines with her aides. One line stood out. "I'm going to make him look like an uneducated warlord from the jungle." That should light the internet up. The video hit the internet like a Molotov cocktail. Within hours, she was trending for all the wrong reasons. Hashtag Karoline the Mocker. Hashtag racist rhetoric. Hashtag you don't belong here. Sponsors began to pull away from her upcoming book tour. One of her biggest donors issued a public statement distancing himself from her remarks. Protesters appeared outside her campaign events, holding signs that read, "Respect is not optional." In Ouagadougou, Traore remained outwardly quiet. But privately, he was watching everything. His chief of staff approached him in the presidential office with a file. "The damage to her image is already done. If you drop the lawsuit now, you'll still win." Traore glanced at the file, then closed it. "No," he said calmly. "This was never about just image. It's about precedent." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the fields of the capital. "If I don't follow through, they'll say I back down. That I wanted attention, not accountability. This isn't a PR stunt. It's a lesson." His words echoed in the quiet room. Back in the States, Karoline called an emergency team meeting. Her voice was hoarse, her tone rattled. "This is no longer about me looking strong," she said. "This is about survival. If I go to court, I lose. If I settle, I look weak. And if I apologize, I lose my base." For the first time, no one had a suggestion. The room was silent, because for the first time in her career, Karoline Leavitt had picked a fight she couldn't meme her way out of. The courtroom wasn't even full, yet the weight of what was unfolding inside it felt historic. Dozens of journalists filled the benches. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but sketch artists were already hunched over their pads, capturing the moment. At one table sat Karoline Leavitt, flanked by two sharp-suited lawyers and her media advisor pretending not to sweat. At the other sat Ibrahim Traoré, calm, upright, silent. He wore a dark gray suit with no tie, a symbol of formality without submission. At his side was Lizette Mensah, his attorney, unshaken and steady. The judge, a seasoned federal official named Harriet Goldstein, opened the proceedings. "This is a civil matter. Let us treat it with the gravity it deserves." Karoline's legal team launched into a preemptive defense. They framed her remarks as rhetorical flair, a hallmark of political free speech. They cited precedent, played the patriotism card, and leaned heavily into First Amendment protections. Then it was Lizette's turn. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't pace. She simply stood, looked at the judge, then back at Karoline, and said, "Freedom of speech is not freedom from consequence." Miss Leavitt did not debate policy. She targeted character. She weaponized culture and identity. She chose humiliation over discourse, and now she must account for that choice. As she finished, she placed a transcript of the debate, and the leaked rehearsal video, on the judge's bench. The courtroom was silent. Outside, protesters and supporters had divided themselves down the sidewalk, barricaded by police. On one side, American flags, "Free Speech Forever" signs, and Karoline campaign hats. On the other, handmade posters that read, "Respect isn't censorship" and "Dignity over ego." Reporters across the globe scrambled to file headlines. CNN, Traore vs. Leavitt, when diplomacy meets defamation. BBC, cultural collision in American courtroom. Al Jazeera, African leader sues U.S. politician, not for power, but for principle. And inside the courthouse, Traore said nothing. His silence had become his strength. Later that night, at a small press gathering outside the courthouse, a reporter asked him, "Mr. President, what do you hope to gain from this lawsuit?" He looked directly into the camera. "A reminder," he said. "That leadership is measured not by how loud you speak, but by what you choose not to say." The clip aired worldwide. Meanwhile, Karoline returned to her Manhattan apartment, exhausted and bitter. Her advisors had begun advising her not on how to win, but on how to minimize long-term damage. She poured herself a glass of wine, looked out over the city skyline, and whispered the question she hadn't dared say aloud until now. What if I underestimated him? Karoline Leavitt wasn't used to this kind of silence. Not in her own office, not in her own base, and certainly not from the media that once celebrated her for her no-filter style. But since the courtroom hearing, something had shifted. Fox News gave her 3 minutes, buried at the end of a segment. Conservative radio hosts who once begged for her presence were now taking a break. Even social media wasn't the echo chamber it used to be. Her posts were flooded not with support, but with questions. Why didn't you just debate him? Why the personal attacks? What does where he's from have to do with anything? Her carefully crafted brand, the sharp-tongued disruptor, was beginning to look less like bravery and more like recklessness. Behind closed doors, her team had changed tactics. We need a statement, her publicist said. Something that cools things down without admitting fault. Karoline slammed her palm on the table. If I apologize, I'm finished. If you don't, her campaign manager said quietly, you might already be. Meanwhile, Traore wasn't chasing cameras, but cameras were chasing him. During a development summit in Ghana, a BBC reporter asked about the lawsuit again. Traore paused, then answered with precision. This is not about me versus her. It is about how we treat each other when we think no one is watching, and whether we accept accountability when they are. It was short. But it echoed everywhere. Human rights organizations praised him. Even a few U.S. senators, both Republican and Democrat, began to comment. Senator Jeff Flake tweeted, "You don't have to agree with President Traore's politics to respect his conduct. This is what restraint looks like." The tide had turned. That week, Time magazine put him on the cover. The new voice of global poise. Inside was a multi-page spread, not just about the lawsuit, but about his leadership style, his reforms in Burkina Faso, his focus on education, and how his handling of a cultural insult had turned into a masterclass in modern diplomacy. Back in New York, Karoline sat in her makeup chair preparing for a rare interview. "We'll spin this," her producer promised. Strong woman. Attacked for speaking truth. But Karoline knew the truth, she wasn't under attack. She was just outplayed. And she could feel it in the one place that mattered most, the mirror. A soft rain drizzled over Washington, D.C., casting gray light across the monuments. Inside the quiet halls of the Burkinabe embassy, Ibrahim Traoré sat across from a representative of the U.S. State Department. The mood was diplomatic, but cautious. "You're gaining a lot of traction here," the American diplomat said. "The lawsuit, the press, you've built something most leaders don't achieve even after decades in office." Traoré nodded slightly. "I didn't ask for any of this. I responded to an insult with a legal mechanism. Something America prides itself on." The diplomat leaned forward. "And that's why I'm here. There's talk in some corners, whispers, really, that you could be a unifying figure in certain global discussions. Climate, trade, even conflict mediation. People are listening to you now." Traoré tilted his head. "Is this an offer or a warning?" The diplomat smiled, but his eyes were hard. "Both." Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt's legal team was cracking. Internal memos had been leaked, showing that her own advisors had recommended dropping the lawsuit and issuing a limited apology. But Karoline had refused. Now, the leaks were fueling a new round of backlash. CNN, Leavitt ignored advisors, doubled down on defamation. Politico, can the right still defend Karoline's culture crusade? And perhaps most damning, the New York Times editorial board ran a headline that simply read, "Traoré was right." Within her inner circle, morale had bottomed out. "This lawsuit is bleeding us," her campaign director muttered during a midnight strategy call. "Not just politically, financially. We can't keep burning money on a case we're destined to lose. Karoline, staring blankly at her phone screen, said nothing. But across the world, in Ouagadougou, a different scene was playing out. On national television, Traore addressed his country. This lawsuit is not about ego, he said. It's not about revenge. It's about dignity. It's about showing our children that we are not invisible, that we are not anyone's punchline. The crowd watching in the public square erupted in cheers. Children waved flags. Elderly citizens wiped tears from their eyes. In one frame, a young girl whispered to her father, "He made them listen to us." The speech aired in full on international networks. Even critics in the West had to admit, the man was winning hearts, and not just in Africa. Later that night, Karoline finally broke the silence with a tweet. "Maybe I said the wrong words. But I never hated the man. Still, we all make choices. And we live with them." It was the closest thing to remorse she had ever shown. But for Ibrahim Traoré, it wasn't about remorse. It was about precedent. Inside the Federal District Court of Manhattan, a verdict was nearing. After weeks of pretrial motions, media frenzy, and global opinion swings, the judge called both parties to a closed settlement conference. No press. No cameras. Just the truth, and the consequences it carried. Karoline Leavitt sat stiffly, flanked by her legal team. Traore entered calmly, again without fanfare. His lawyer Lizette carried a slim black folder, the proposed terms of settlement. Judge Goldstein opened the session. This case is unique. Political, yes, but deeply personal. And now, both sides have expressed interest in avoiding a prolonged trial. Let's discuss. Karoline's attorney cleared his throat. We propose a mutual walkback. A mess. Leavitt will release a statement expressing regret over the nature of her comments. Mr. Traore drops the financial claim. No admission of guilt. No further legal action. Lizette raised a brow. That's not accountability. That's theater. Judge Goldstein turned to Traore. Mr. President, are you open to compromise? Traore leaned forward, locking eyes with Karoline. I came to this country with respect, he said. And I was told I didn't belong. On live television. By someone who represents a faction of this nation's future. Karoline fidgeted. She had expected lectures. But not calm. I am not asking for your career, he continued. I am asking for a line to be drawn. So that the next time someone in power wants to humiliate another, they remember this room. He slid the black folder forward. Inside, a settlement proposal with 3 terms. 1. A public statement of apology, handwritten and read aloud. 2. A $100,000 donation, not to Traore, but to an education initiative for African immigrants in the U.S. 3. A joint photo, shaking hands, as a gesture of reconciliation, not for optics, but for history. Karoline was stunned. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't theater. It was statesmanship. Judge Goldstein looked between them. Ms. Leavitt? Karoline was quiet. Then, slowly, she said. I underestimated you. Traore didn't smile. He simply nodded. Many have. Later that evening, in front of a packed press gallery, Karoline read the letter. To President Ibrahim Traoré and to all who watched and felt unseen by my words, I apologize. My remarks were wrong, not because they offended, but because they diminished. That is not leadership. And it is not who I wish to be. As cameras clicked and journalists filed reports, Traoré stood beside her, dignified as ever. The moment made headlines. NBC, apology accepted. But the lesson remains. Le Monde, Traoré teaches America the meaning of dignity. Even critics couldn't ignore the shift. In that moment, the lawsuit was no longer the story. The lesson was. 2 days after the settlement, the photo of Traore and Leavitt shaking hands made the front page of nearly every major outlet in the world. But this time, it wasn't the photo itself that went viral, it was what it represented. A former cable news star who built her reputation on confrontation. A West African president who had walked into a foreign political arena and demanded respect, not with anger, but with principle. Together, they had created an image that defied modern political theater: reconciliation without humiliation. Accountability without vengeance. In high schools across the U.S., the clip of Traore's courtroom remarks became part of civics classes. In Burkina Faso, the donation fund for African immigrants was matched 10 times over by private citizens. And in immigrant communities from New York to Los Angeles, something had shifted: pride. For Karoline Leavitt, the political cost had been severe. Her donors were split. Some abandoned her entirely, unable to accept the apology. Others remained, quietly acknowledging that her confrontation with Traore had humbled her in a way no debate ever had. She began taking fewer interviews. Focused more on policy than persona. She didn't say it publicly, but her entire tone had shifted. Softer. Sharper. Less performative. For Traore, the lawsuit wasn't a chapter, it was a platform. He was invited to speak at the United Nations again. This time, not just about African sovereignty or resource rights, but about the moral weight of leadership in a divided world. "I didn't come here to lecture," he said in that calm, unwavering voice. "I came here to remind you that dignity is not a cultural artifact, it is a human expectation." The room stood still. After his speech, a U.S. senator approached him backstage. "You've done more with one lawsuit than we've done with 20 resolutions." Traore smiled faintly. "Because I never asked to win. I asked to be heard." Back in Burkina Faso, children recited excerpts of his apology speech not for propaganda, but for inspiration. A young boy named Amadou told his teacher, "When I grow up, I want to be like Traore." Not because he sued someone, but because he didn't yell. That night, as Traore stood on the balcony of the presidential residence, the lights of Ouagadougou flickering below him, he was handed a copy of Time magazine again. A second cover. This time it read, "Dignity wins." He folded it in half, smiled, and whispered to himself. They didn't see it coming. But now they'll never forget it. Months had passed. The courtroom echo had faded, but its impact had not. What began as a careless insult had become an international masterclass in restraint, justice, and dignity. Traore had returned to Burkina Faso with more than a legal victory. He returned with a new level of global recognition, not just as a leader, but as a symbol of principled strength. In the presidential garden, a group of university students from Ghana, Senegal, and Côte d'Ivoire gathered for a policy workshop. It was part of a new initiative he launched, Voices of the Next Generation. The goal was simple: to teach leadership through example, not lecture. He stepped onto the open-air podium and looked over the students. "I want to tell you something I learned not from war," he said, "but from a courtroom." They listened in silence. "When someone tells you that you don't belong in the room," he continued, "you don't shout back. You stay in that room. You speak clearly. You hold your ground. And eventually, even your enemies will hear you, not because you are loud, but because you are right." The crowd applauded. But it wasn't just the students who were moved. Across the ocean, Karoline Leavitt watched a live stream of the event. She was no longer in the spotlight, no longer the media darling she once was. But something had changed in her too. She was reading more. Listening more. She'd begun speaking at colleges about political humility, and yes, she mentioned Traore by name. "He forced me to see my reflection," she admitted in a lecture at Georgetown. "And for once, I didn't like what I saw." That is the power of principled resistance. And I thank him for it. The story was over. But its consequences rippled outward. The $100,000 fund became a full-fledged foundation, funding over 300 scholarships within a year. The courtroom transcripts were translated into 5 languages and published under the title, "You Don't Belong in This Room: The Lawsuit That Redefined Leadership." And as the year came to a close, Traore sat in his study writing a letter. Not to a politician. Not to a diplomat. But to a boy named Amadou, the same child who had said, "I want to be like Traore." The letter read, "Dear Amadou, if you ever find yourself in a room where they say you don't belong, stay. Look them in the eye. Speak the truth. And remember, a voice grounded in dignity can shake the foundations of any empire." Ibrahim Traoré. He sealed the letter, placed it in a plain envelope, and smiled. It was never about a lawsuit. It was about a lesson. And now, the world had learned it. And so, what began as a moment of mockery on live television became a global turning point. When Karoline Leavitt said, "You don't belong in this room," she thought it was a throwaway insult, a headline for a single night. But she underestimated something far greater than herself, the quiet strength of a man who didn't need to shout to be heard. Ibrahim Traoré didn't respond with rage. He didn't retreat. He responded with law. With grace. With clarity. And in doing so, he reminded the world, and especially the West, that dignity is not something you grant to others. It is something you recognize in them. From the courtroom to the classrooms, from late-night debates to the pages of Time magazine, this story echoed because it was never about one insult. It was about who decides who belongs. And what happens when someone challenged that, not with power, but with principle. Leaders rise and fall. Headlines fade. But the lesson remains. True power isn't in silencing others. It's in refusing to be silenced. And Ibrahim Traoré? He didn't just win a lawsuit. He changed the conversation.